Hi guys, welcome to another video on Jujutsu Kaisen Phantom Parade. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about how does damage calculation actually work in this game. And more specifically, I will mention about the type of different buff and debuff you can actually apply to the enemy, and what is the best combination in order to maximize your damage. So you're actually applying your buff and debuff correctly. Now, I am going to show you guys something from the one of the JP Wikipedia or guide pages, and they actually have this damage calculation written here. I'm not sure how did they come up with this, but I will show you guys some of the testing I have done in the game myself, and I do feel this is more or less accurate, and I'll show you guys why. But if you just take a look at this formula by itself, what it's basically saying is that you have the increase plus damage dealt plus increase of damage taken times by the increase in either physical or curse technique increase, and then also times by the debuff on physical or curse technique damage taken. And what you can basically see here is that basically you're kind of splitting it into three different type of components. However, not all of the components are being treated separately. And basically, if it's actually specifically on physical or curse technique, you can see that the buff and debuff are actually applied with a multiplicative relationship. So you are times them by themselves. For example, you are increasing your physical buff times by physical debuff. However, if it's just a straight up damage reduction or damage dealt increase, what you actually notice that they are being treated with a simple addition relationship. So rather than multiplying between themselves, they're actually adding up together. And that is actually going to be a one very crucial point when you're deciding what characters you want to bring. Because if you guys didn't realize, if we actually take a look at the very different buff or debuff skills that we have in the game, you can take a look and see what Yaga is able to do is that he's able to apply physical and curse technique increase. So that is basically something that will always have a multiply effect. However, if you actually take a look at what you have for Nanami, it's just a straight up damage dealt, and that is also the case for Momo. And what that can already tell you guys is that if you actually, let's say if I don't actually bring Yaga into a team, if I just bring Nanami and Momo together, what I'm actually doing is I'm adding up the damage buff together rather than multiplying them. However, if I'm bringing Yaga plus one of Nanami or one of Momo, I'm actually multiplying them together, and that's why you're gonna see a lot more damage increase when you actually bring Yaga plus one out of Nanami and Momo, rather than bring Nanami and Momo instead of Yaga. So that's basically one crucial point I have to remember, and this also applies to debuff as well. Now, a lot of people think the best debuffer in the game is Incomplete Domain Megumi, because if we actually take a look at Incomplete Domain Megumi, you can see he is able to do something crazy, which is he's able to, when the domain expansion is out, he's able to do almost like 100% damage taker increase. However, if you actually compare this to another debuffer, which is Ghetto, what you don't actually realize is that Ghetto's debuff is actually just for curse technique. And on first look, so it says here like 30% curse technique. So on a first look, what you actually seem to say is that this is not actually that good, right? Because the numbers are a lot lower than what you have with Megumi. However, I'll show you some calculation later on. And what you actually can turn out is that, for example, if we bring Megumi plus Nanami, remember both of them are doing buff or debuff to damage dealt, and therefore you're actually adding up the two numbers together. And if you then compare this to, for example, if I'm actually going to bring Ghetto instead, because Ghetto actually does curse technique debuff rather than a damage debuff, like a straight up damage debuff, you're actually multiplying the two effects together, and that can actually work out to be more powerful in certain scenarios. And that is basically something you want to bear in mind. Depending on which buffer or supporter you're going to bring in the battle, maybe slightly different combination will actually turn out to give higher damage overall. So that's something you do have to bear in mind. Okay, now obviously I have said all about that, but let me actually show you in battle itself so you can actually validate this is true as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to battle this stage. I'm going to probably try each combination of buffers like twice, just so that because there's normally a bit of variation in damage dealt, so I just want to make sure I can get like a good average in order to actually compare. But what I'm actually going to do is that I'm going to compare first of all using how how should I start off? I think I will start off by first of all using comparing Nanami against Ghetto. And basically, if you actually take a look at the skill level on these two characters, what I have right now here is I have Nanami skill 2 at level 8, and what it's able to do is able to do a 31.4 damage dealt to all of allies other than yourself. So that's 31.4. That's a numerical value. And if you then take a look at what my Ghetto have, this is able to do a 31.3 debuff to just curse technique. So in theory, the numbers are very similar, right? One 31.4, one 31.3. So if I actually use the combination of just, for example, just Nanami or just Ghetto, you will see they should be more or less similar. However, what you're actually going to find out is that because I'm also bringing Momo together, if I actually bring Momo and Nanami together, what I'm actually doing is I'm adding up those two. Whereas if I'm actually bringing Ghetto, I'm time multiplying the damage from Yaga and Momo and also Ghetto together, rather than Yaga times by Nanami plus Momo. And in theory, if you actually test it, the number from Ghetto or the damage dealt from Ghetto should be slightly higher than Nanami if the damage calculation is actually true. And that's something we are going to test out here. Okay, so let's go into battle first of all with just Nanami. Okay, I picked this stage which only have a single boss, by the way, so it's a bit easier for me to see. And what I'm going to do in all of my testing is that on the first turn, I'm going to do the buff or the debuff from everyone. I'm just going to do a single target, skill 1. And I will be looking for the damage which is not crit. Okay, so that's 150. So that's 150k damage dealt there, and it wasn't crit. Now let me restart this battle and try again, just so that I can make sure there's not like too much variation of damage dealt by a single combination. Okay, so the exact same combination again. If you notice this recollection, that is basically to increase curse energy at start of battle, which is what I need in order for my Ghetto actually use his debuff straight away on turn 1. But obviously it doesn't make any difference for Nanami. Okay, so now let's do this again. So once again, buff from everyone and the single skill 1. You can see 154. So we can see it's somewhere around the 150-ish mark. So now let's change the character to Ghetto and let's see what the damage is. And if the damage calculation is actually correct, we should be expecting to see more damage from Ghetto. So let's bring Ghetto here. And this is where this reflection is going to be useful, because Ghetto can only use his debuff, his skill 2 only have that debuff effect when his curse energy is 40 before you actually use that move. So normally, because my Ghetto's not dupe, so he will only have 30. However, with that recollection, I can actually increase it. So now let me do this. So Momo and Yaga will still be doing their buff, but Ghetto will obviously be doing the debuff. And let's see what's the damage going to be. See, 161. It's already a bit higher, but let's just repeat it in case, it's just a bit of variation in the damage. I think that was 161k. So if you remember, the ones from Nanami is only 150k, okay? So once again, skill 2 from everyone and go to your skill 1. 168k. You see, the damage is a lot higher than what Nanami is able to do. And okay, now if we revisit the damage formula again and just see what did we actually test for. So what we have done was comparing Nanami's buff against Ghetto's buff, while we also have Momo's buff, which is also increased damage dealt. And what we can clearly see is that Ghetto's debuff, even though it has the same numerical value as Nanami, we were able to see higher damage. And that is because the debuff is treated separately to the increase in damage dealt, and therefore therefore we have that multiplying effect. However, when we actually take a look at just Momo plus Nanami, what happens is that because they're both increased damage, that we're adding up them together rather than multiplying them. And that already immediately tells us is that when you actually have different type of buff or debuff, they are going to do a lot more damage in total because of that multiplicative effect rather than when you have the same buff multiple times. Okay, now one thing we didn't quite test is that yes, we have tested two increased damage dealt, the one from Nanami and the one from Momo, and they do add up together as we have seen. However, what happens when you have increased damage dealt and also increased damage taken? So basically the damage dealt debuff and also damage dealt buff, are they also actually add up together and treated as the same rather than treated with like a multiplying effect? So that is going to be the same we test next. And the way we're going to test it is we're going to use Yaga. And the way it's going to do is because if you actually take a look at Yaga skill 2, what we can see is that this one increased curse technique, and this is the 43.8. And I also have his skill 3 at level 8, which is basically a 43.4 debuff. And what you can see here is the actual numerical value is going to be very similar. However, because this one is a curse technique, whilst this one is actually a damage taken debuff, if this formula is actually correct, when we actually use Yaga skill 3, we will be adding up whatever damage buff they have alongside with how we are calculating Momo and Nanami. So basically all three of the buff or debuff will just simply be added up together. In comparison to if we actually use Yaga skill 2, what we're going to have is that we are going to have the buff from Yaga times by the sum of Nanami and also Momo's buff. And because there's that multiplying effect, even though the actual numerical value from Yaga skill 2 and also skill 3 are the same, we should be expecting to see much higher damage when we actually use his skill 2 in comparison to skill 3. Now, if you still remember, we have already tested this combination when we use skill 2 on everyone, and this combination had about around 150k damage. So if we actually test this again now, the same exact team, but we're using Yaga skill 3 instead, we should in theory see a much lower damage output than 150k because we will be adding up the debuff and buff together rather than multiplying them. So sorry, so let's actually test this out to see whether that's actually indeed the case. So for Yaga, I'll be using skill 3, and then for Nanami and Momo, I'll be using skill 2, and then I'll do a skill 1 from Gojo to see what the damage is going to be. And we'll try to see whether it's lower than 150k. And you can see here, that's 132k, so it's definitely lower. But once again, for fairness, I'm going to do this again just to make sure there isn't like a huge variation between the damage by itself. Okay, so sorry, Yaga should be doing skill 3, Nanami and Momo both skill 2, and then we finish off the skill 1 from Blue Gojo. And let's see what the damage output is going to be. 126. So as you can see, this is around the 120k to 130k mark. Whereas if we actually use skill 2 on everyone, we already saw earlier, that's actually 150k. So once again, the damage output is quite, the difference quite obvious. So now we are also able to validate this, that indeed, when it's actually damage dealt, the buff and debuff are treated together, so you actually add them up. However, when it's not damage dealt, but actually like curse technique or physical technique, what you're actually doing is the buff and debuff will be multiplying to each other rather than addition. And that is going to be one very crucial difference in order to actually maximize your damage output. Okay, now that we have actually validated the damage calculation formula, let's take a look at some of the actual real life numbers that of the buff and debuff the different supporters are able to give, and then we'll bring in some different combinations, and I will show you two scenarios which are quite interesting and you guys may not know about it before, and this could actually change the way you're going to play your team in the future. Okay, so first of all, just background. So what I've done is I've taken the level 10 skill of every single character, and what I've done is I have done it based on the maximum number of stacks they're able to do. So for example, for Yoga, it's 45.8%, and you're able to stack it 4 times. So that's basically the number you get. Momo, you're only able to stack it twice, so that's the number you get. Megumi is a bit of a special case because not only he's able to apply his debuff through his skill 1 when there's domain expansion, but also the domain expansion by itself is able to give a 45% damage delta increase as well. So sorry, well, damage taken increase as well. So therefore, that is actually going to be the total number, which is 45% times 3 stacks of 99.3. And then Ghetto is basically just simply 3.1 times 3, and Kaito is 128.7, and that's just a single time. Okay. Now, and also Nanami, I forgot to show, but same thing. So it's 4.4% times by 4. Okay. Now let's take a look at the first scenario, which I'm going to show you, which is you for some reason only decided to bring Kaito plus 1 other buffer, which is actually quite common. For example, you might be bringing Toge in your other slot because you want to do maximum amount of damage. And a lot of time what you guys will put, which kind of makes sense because normally you're saying Yaga is the best buffer out there, right? Because Yaga basically have a higher damage multiplier, so a buff multiplier than anyone else, with the exception of Incomplete Domain Megumi, but Incomplete Domain Megumi can only do that within his domain expansion, whereas Yaga can do it anytime. So normally people always say Yaga is the best buffer, so therefore I'm going to put Yaga in. However, in this kind of scenario, when you only have Kaito as other buffer, what you have to realize is that Yaga is able to do a curse technique increase and physical technique increase, whereas Kaito's ultimate is only curse technique increase. So when you actually use a curse technique user, what you actually see is that these two buffs, they're identical. They're the same type. So the damage calculation in this sense, it will just simply be adding them up. So you have the base 100%, and then you plus the buff from Yaga and then the buff from Kaito, and you get up a total of 412%. However, what happens when it's Kaito Nanami? Now the damage formula is actually going to be different because you're actually multiplying the two numbers together. So what you have to do is you take the base 100% and plus the whatever buff Nanami have, and then you multiply it by the base 100% plus whatever Kaito is able to give, and that is 543. And what you can see is actually no, Kaito plus Nanami actually do better than Kaito plus Yaga, even though Yaga has much higher base numerical value than what Kaito is able to offer, which some of you guys may not know. Now there's one thing which I'm not too sure, by the way, is that what I've done is the base 100% plus the buff from Yaga plus the buff from Kaito. I'm not sure whether I should be doing this twice. Maybe it should be 100% plus the value from Yaga and then another 100% plus the value from Kaito. That could also be the formula. But even if I do it that way, it's still going to be less than what Kaito plus Nanami is able to give. And to be honest, I don't think, I mean, it could be like this, but in theory, you're only stacking up the buff together. You shouldn't be stacking up the base damage because then you'll be double counting. So I don't think this is the right formula, but I just want to show you guys, even if you do actually double count the base damage because they actually apply to each of the buff individually, it's still going to be lower than what Kaito plus Nanami is going to give. Okay, but now I'm just going to change the number back because that is the number I believe it's trying to do. You shouldn't be double counting the base percentage. Okay, so that's going to be the first scenario I'll show you, which I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't realize because by default a lot of people just bring Yaga and thinking it's the best buffer. But now let's talk about the second scenario, which is a lot of time people saying incomplete domain Megumi is so much better than Ghetto, right? Just take a look at his buff number, 343 when you stack it 3 times versus what Ghetto is able to stack 3 times, only 99%. Okay, that is also quite simple. However, when we actually talk about incomplete domain Megumi, you have to realize what incomplete domain Megumi is actually able to do is only when he has his domain expansion out. Outside his domain expansion, he basically gives no debuff at all, right? And even within his incomplete um, domain expansion, you're not always going to hit that debuff stack all the time because that is only going to happen when you stack it up 3 times. And basically what's going to happen is on turn 1, you can only stack it once, so the number is a bit lower. Then turn 2 is a bit higher, but not quite as high as the maximum. Turn 3 is going to reach its peak, and then afterwards turn 4, one stack will have expired, and you will also be outside of the domain expansion, so you also lose that initial 45%. And then turn 5, you only have one stack of the debuff. So basically, yes, at the highest point, you are able to get very, very high damage output. And in fact, if I bring a combination with like Yaga plus Nanami plus Incomplete Domain Megumi, if you remember, Nanami and Incomplete Domain Megumi, they're both damage dealt, buff or debuff, so you add them up together, and then you multiply that by whatever Yaga is able to give. That is able to give you a whooping 1,644% increase in your damage output. But that's just for turn 3. And if I come back to Yaga plus Nanami plus Ghetto situation, because all three are going to be 3 different type of buff or debuff, you are actually going to be multiplying them all together. So you can see at its peak, it's only able to do 1,341, which is definitely lower than what Incomplete Domain Megumi is able to do. However, if you actually add up the damage output across all 5 turns, bearing in mind Incomplete Domain Megumi is not able to do anything outside his domain expansion, whereas for Ghetto, theoretically, if you actually conserve your curse energy well, you can actually make sure you stack up his 3 stacks of debuff every single turn for a very, really long time. So actually what you're able to see is you're able to see this consistent damage output even within the 5 turns that domain expansions out. And if you actually add up all of them together in total, you actually see that this combination of Yaga plus Nanami plus Ghetto is actually going to be higher than Yaga plus Nanami plus Incomplete Domain Megumi if you actually compare the total damage output within those 5 turns. Now obviously real life it may not actually be happening like that. Sometimes you may be just going for like a one shot on this turn where you're able to do the maximum amount of damage. For example, you have like a nuke trying to do an ultimate attack on turn 3 of Incomplete Domain Megumi, then in which case yes, Incomplete Domain Megumi would be more beneficial than Ghetto. However, if you're actually playing a long sustained battle where you actually need to not just do damage on one single turn but over multiple turns, you may actually be surprised that Ghetto is actually able to bring more debuff or more damage increase to your entire battle than what Incomplete Domain Megumi is able to do.